The first thing I noticed was the parking lot. My hunting cabin didn't have a parking lot. The second thing I noticed was the sign. My hunting cabin definitely didn't have a sign. And the third thing I noticed nearly made me drive off the mountain, because hanging above my front porch was a giant wooden banner that read, "Welcome to Bear Creek Lodge." I slammed on the brakes. My coffee spilled all over the dashboard. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring. Then I checked the address, then the property markers, then the GPS, then the cabin, because surely I had to be losing my mind. But no, it was my cabin, my land, my porch, my driveway, my front door. And somehow, while I'd been away for 3 months on an extended wildlife survey project in Alaska, somebody had turned my private hunting cabin into what appeared to be a small hotel. What I didn't know yet was that the HOA president behind it all was about to have the worst week of her life. My name is Tyler Bennett. My grandfather built that cabin in 1972. Back then, the mountains outside Cedar Ridge were mostly untouched forest. No gated communities, no luxury developments, no homeowner associations, just woods, streams, and wildlife. The cabin sat on 12 acres near Bear Creek. It wasn't fancy. 1 bedroom, a loft, a stone fireplace, a covered porch, everything built by hand. It held decades of memories, fishing trips, hunting weekends, family gatherings, the kind of place you can't replace. Over the years, development slowly moved closer. Eventually, a large neighborhood called Pine Summit Estates appeared less than a mile away. With the neighborhood came an HOA. Fortunately, my property wasn't inside it. Never had been. Never would be. That fact would become extremely important later. Before leaving for Alaska, I'd locked the cabin, shut off unnecessary utilities, and arranged for my neighbor Frank to occasionally check the property. Everything should have been fine. Instead, the moment I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was very wrong. Cars filled the area around the cabin. SUVs, pickup trucks, minivans, out-of-state license plates. People were everywhere. A family was unloading luggage. 2 kids were playing near my woodshed. Someone was sitting in my rocking chair. My rocking chair. I stared in disbelief. Then a woman stepped onto the porch carrying a stack of towels. Towels. At my hunting cabin. She smiled. "Checking in?" I blinked. "What? Checking in?" I looked around, then pointed at the cabin. "This is my cabin." She laughed. Actually laughed, as if I'd made a joke. "Oh, that's funny." No, I wasn't smiling. "I'm serious." Her smile disappeared. Before she could answer, another vehicle arrived. A luxury SUV. Out stepped a woman wearing designer sunglasses and a bright red blazer. Even from 50 yards away, I recognized her. Karen Whitmore, president of the Pine Summit HOA. And the last person I wanted to see standing on my property? Karen froze the second she spotted me. For a brief moment, genuine panic crossed her face. Then it vanished, replaced by a smile, a very forced smile. "Tyler," I stepped forward. "Karen." The guests nearby sensed tension immediately. Conversations stopped. People began watching. Karen walked toward me. "You're back early." I stared at her. "Early? You weren't expected until next month." That sentence sent a chill down my spine. Not because of what she said, because of what it implied. Someone had been keeping track of my schedule. Someone had known I was away. Someone had planned around it. I pointed toward the banner hanging above my porch. "What is that?" Karen folded her arms. "It's a community hospitality initiative." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so absurd. "A what?" "The neighborhood needed additional lodging options." I looked at my cabin, then at Karen, then back at the cabin. "You turned my property into a hotel?" "It's more of a lodge." My jaw tightened. "No, it's trespassing." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Karen noticed, and immediately shifted into presentation mode. The same tone people use when trying to sound reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. "Tyler, the property was sitting unused." It's my property. The community needed it. It's my property. The board voted. I stared at her. The board voted on land they don't own? Karen didn't answer directly, which told me everything. I walked toward the porch. Karen quickly stepped in front of me. Guests are currently checked in. I stopped, slowly. Move. She didn't. Move. Still nothing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Frank's pickup truck came flying down the driveway. Dust exploded behind him. He jumped out before the truck fully stopped. Tyler! Frank! He looked relieved, then angry, then embarrassed. All at once. I tried calling you. My stomach dropped. What happened? Frank glanced at Karen, then back at me. They changed the locks. My blood ran cold. What? They said the property was abandoned. I turned toward Karen. Abandoned? You were gone for months. I was working. There was no activity. It wasn't your property. Frank stepped closer. Tyler, that's not even the worst part. I frowned. What do you mean? He pointed toward the rear of the cabin. They converted the storage room. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My grandfather's storage room contained hunting gear, old photographs, family records, and decades of personal belongings. I immediately pushed past Karen and headed toward the back. She tried stopping me. I ignored her. The rear door opened, and I froze. The room had been transformed. Gone were the shelves. Gone were the family items. Gone were the storage trunks. Instead, there were bunk beds. 6 of them. 12 sleeping spaces. Extension cords everywhere. Portable heaters. Mini refrigerators. Cheap furniture. My family's history had been replaced by what looked like an overcrowded budget motel. I stood there speechless. Karen appeared behind me. We increased capacity. I slowly turned around. You what? Before she could answer, a loud alarm suddenly echoed from somewhere inside the cabin. Everyone jumped. Guests looked confused. Karen looked nervous. Very nervous. Then Frank whispered something that made my stomach drop. Tyler. What? I don't think any of this was inspected. I looked around the room. The overloaded extension cords, the heaters, the blocked exits, the bunk beds, the makeshift wiring. And suddenly I wasn't just angry anymore. I was concerned. Because if what Frank suspected was true, this wasn't just trespassing. This was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling the fire marshal was going to be very interested in what he'd find here. The alarm continued beeping somewhere inside the cabin. Not a smoke alarm. Not exactly. It sounded more like a low battery warning from a detector that hadn't been maintained, which wasn't reassuring, especially considering what I was looking at. 12 bunk spaces crammed into a room originally designed for storage. Portable heaters plugged into extension cords. Power strips connected to other power strips. Wires running beneath rugs. Boxes stacked near exits. And dozens of people staying in a building never intended to function as a hotel. I looked at Karen. When was this inspected? She hesitated. Just long enough. That was answer enough. Frank sighed beside me. Oh boy. The guests were starting to realize something was wrong. A family standing near the hallway exchanged worried looks. A man carrying luggage slowly set it down. Another guest pulled out a phone and started recording. Not a good sign. Karen quickly tried to regain control. Everything is perfectly safe. I pointed toward a power strip supporting 2 heaters, a refrigerator, and several chargers. No, it isn't. She ignored me. You're overreacting. I laughed. Again, not because anything was funny. Because people always accuse you of overreacting right before reality proves otherwise. A teenage guest walked over. Excuse me. I turned. Yeah? My room doesn't have a window. I blinked. What? He pointed toward a side section of the cabin. Karen immediately interrupted. It's temporary. The kid looked confused. So is that bad? Frank answered before I could. Very. The teenager's parents immediately appeared. Then more questions started coming. Lots of questions. Questions Karen clearly hadn't prepared for. Are we actually in a hotel? Is this licensed? Who owns the property? Is this legal? Why are there extension cords everywhere? Karen's smile became increasingly strained. Meanwhile, I started walking through the cabin. The more I saw, the worse things got. My grandfather's workshop had become a guest room. The old game storage area had become sleeping quarters. The loft held extra mattresses. Even the enclosed porch had been converted into overflow accommodations. Every available inch of space had been monetized. Every inch. It was unbelievable. Then I noticed something else. The occupancy board hanging near the entrance. Someone had written, "Maximum guests, 2828." I stared at the number. The cabin was originally designed for 4 people, maybe 6 during holidays. Not 28. 28 was insanity. Frank saw my expression. Yeah, I shook my head. They actually posted it. Apparently. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. Nobody involved understood building safety, or occupancy rules, or fire regulations, or maybe they understood them and simply ignored them. Neither possibility was encouraging. Then I found the emergency exit map. Actually, I found what was pretending to be an emergency exit map. A photocopied sheet taped to a wall. Half the directions were wrong. One exit path literally pointed through a locked storage area. I closed my eyes for a moment, then pulled out my phone. Karen immediately noticed. "Who are you calling?" I looked at her. "The people who deal with situations like this." Her face changed instantly. Not panic, not yet, but concern. Real concern. I stepped outside and made the call. The county office transferred me twice. Then I reached someone in fire prevention. I explained the situation, the property ownership issue, the occupancy changes, the makeshift hotel operation, the bunk rooms, the extension cords, the portable heaters, the blocked exits. The silence on the other end grew longer and longer. Finally, the man spoke. "You're saying this is operating as a lodging facility?" "Yes." "And it wasn't designed for that purpose?" "No." "Has it been inspected?" "Not that I can find." Another pause. Then, "We'll send someone." Those 4 words immediately improved my mood. A lot. When I returned inside, Karen was attempting damage control. She had gathered several guests into a small group. "I assure everyone that everything is compliant." One guest raised a hand. "Compliant with what?" Nobody answered. Another guest spoke. "The owner says this isn't authorized." Karen smiled. A nervous smile. "The situation is being misunderstood." I almost admired the commitment. Even when standing inside an obvious disaster, she still spoke like a press release. Then came the moment everything started falling apart. A woman carrying a suitcase approached me. "Do you own this place?" "Yes." Her eyes widened. "Actually own it?" "Yes." She looked toward Karen, then back at me. "We paid to stay here." That got everyone's attention. Every guest within earshot turned around. The woman continued. "We booked through the HOA website." Frank muttered something under his breath. It wasn't complimentary. I couldn't blame him. Apparently, the HOA hadn't simply occupied the cabin. They'd been charging people. A lot of people. That revelation spread through the building like wildfire. Guests started checking reservation emails, looking at receipts, comparing prices. One family had paid nearly $500 for a weekend stay. Another had booked a week. A third had traveled from another state. The atmosphere shifted instantly. People stopped acting like tourists. They started acting like customers who suspected they'd been misled, which was much more dangerous for Karen. Then we heard vehicles outside, multiple vehicles, doors closing, radios crackling, heavy footsteps. I looked through the front window and smiled. 3 county vehicles had arrived. One carried fire prevention markings, another belonged to building safety. The third was from code enforcement. Karen looked too, and for the first time all day, She looked genuinely scared. A man in a dark uniform stepped onto the porch. Fire Marshal Daniel Reeves. I'd met him once years earlier during a wildfire preparedness seminar. Thorough, professional, and not known for tolerating shortcuts. He entered the cabin, looked around once, then looked around again. The second look lasted much longer. That's when I knew things were about to get very interesting. Reeves walked slowly through the main room, studying everything: the heaters, the wiring, the occupancy setup, the furniture arrangement, the emergency exits, the sleeping areas, every detail. Nobody spoke, nobody wanted to. The silence was almost painful. Finally, he stopped beside a power strip overloaded with equipment. He looked at Karen. Who approved this? The question sounded simple, but something about the way he asked it made the entire room tense. Karen swallowed. I oversee the HOA. Reeves nodded, then wrote something on a clipboard. That was never a good sign. A building inspector joined him, then another official. They began moving through the cabin room by room, taking photographs, making notes, asking questions. The list on their clipboard seemed to grow every minute, and with every page they filled, Karen looked more worried, because she was finally starting to understand something. The problem wasn't Tyler anymore. The problem wasn't the guests. The problem wasn't even property ownership. The problem was what the inspectors were finding. And judging by their expressions, they were finding a lot. The inspection lasted less than 40 minutes. That alone told me everything. When inspectors find nothing wrong, inspections take time. When they find problems immediately, things move much faster. Fire Marshal Reeves walked through every room with a growing stack of notes. The building inspector wasn't looking any happier. Neither was the code enforcement officer. Every few minutes, one of them would point at something and quietly discuss it with the others. Portable heaters, extension cords, blocked exits, improvised sleeping areas, missing emergency lighting, occupancy issues, electrical concerns. The list kept growing. By the end, Karen looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The guests sensed it too. Nobody was smiling anymore. Nobody was talking about vacation plans. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. Finally, Reeves gathered everyone in the main room. Guests, HOA representatives, inspectors, contractors, anyone involved. The room became completely silent. He looked around once, then opened his clipboard. The structure was originally permitted as a private recreational cabin. Nobody spoke. It is not approved as a lodging facility. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Reeves continued. The current occupancy arrangement violates multiple safety standards. A guest slowly lowered his phone. Another folded her arms. Everyone listened. The building lacks required systems for commercial overnight use. More notes. More silence. Then came the sentence that ended everything. Effective immediately, this facility is closed. The room froze. Karen's face turned pale. Several guests exchanged shocked looks. One family immediately began gathering luggage. Reeves wasn't finished. The building cannot be occupied as a hotel, lodge, inn, rental facility, or commercial accommodation. The words landed like concrete. Every possible loophole disappeared. Karen tried one final attempt. There must be a way to correct. No. The answer came instantly. Not angry, not emotional, just final. The kind of answer delivered by someone whose decision isn't negotiable. The fire marshal handed paperwork to Karen, then additional paperwork to the code enforcement officer, then even more paperwork to the building inspector. That stack seemed surprisingly thick, very thick. Meanwhile, guests began asking questions, lots of questions. When do we get refunds? Who pays for our travel expenses? What about our reservations? Who approved this place? Every question pointed toward the same person, Karen. And for once, she didn't have answers. One family had driven 6 hours, another had booked a week-long stay, several guests had prepaid months earlier. The realization spread quickly. The HOA hadn't simply occupied my cabin. It had been operating a business on property it didn't own, without proper authorization, without required approvals, without safety compliance, without permission from the actual owner. The deeper people looked, the worse it became. Frank leaned toward me. Think she's finally understanding? I watched Karen staring at the shutdown notice. Yeah, I think she is. The guests were escorted out over the next few hours. Most remained surprisingly polite. A few were frustrated. Some were furious. One demanded immediate reimbursement. Another threatened legal action. Nobody blamed them. They'd paid for accommodations they believed were legitimate. Instead, they'd unknowingly checked into a disaster waiting to happen. By sunset, the cabin was empty. For the first time since arriving, I stood alone on my porch. My porch. The sign reading Bear Creek Lodge had already been removed. The fake occupancy notices were gone. The registration desk had disappeared. The entire operation had collapsed in a single afternoon. But the real fallout was still ahead. The following week, Pine Summit Estates held an emergency HOA meeting. Attendance broke every previous record. Residents filled the clubhouse, then the hallway, then the parking lot. People wanted answers, and they wanted them badly. The HOA attorney spoke first. Never a good sign. He summarized the ownership issue, the unauthorized occupancy, the safety violations, the shutdown order, the liability concerns. Then came the financial section. The room became very quiet. Apparently, refund obligations alone were substantial. Then came legal consultation costs, investigation costs, administrative costs, compliance reviews, insurance concerns, potential claims. The list seemed endless. Residents stared in disbelief. One homeowner finally stood. "You mean to tell me we turned someone else's cabin into a hotel?" "Yes." The attorney didn't sugarcoat anything. Another resident stood. "And nobody verified ownership first?" Silence. A third resident raised his hand. "And nobody checked permits?" More silence. Every unanswered question made things worse. Finally, an elderly homeowner who had lived there since the neighborhood was built approached the microphone. The room immediately quieted. He looked toward the board, then toward Karen, then at the crowd. "When you stop respecting boundaries," he paused, "you eventually hit one." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. And this community just hit one at full speed. The room erupted into applause, not because people enjoyed the situation, because they knew he was right. A few minutes later, the board entered a private session. When they returned, everyone already knew what was coming. The board president stood, took a breath, then announced, "Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore is removed from her position." Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. There was simply relief. Relief that the problem had finally ended. Karen quietly gathered her belongings. She didn't argue. She didn't make a speech. She simply walked toward the exit. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Then she left. The door closed behind her, and the room felt lighter. Months later, the cabin was finally restored. The bunk beds disappeared. The wiring was repaired. The storage room was rebuilt. My grandfather's belongings were recovered from various storage units. The workshop returned. The porch returned. The cabin returned. One evening, Frank stopped by carrying coffee. We sat on the porch watching the sunset. The mountains glowed orange. The creek reflected the evening light. Everything felt normal again. Frank laughed. "You know, people still call it the hotel cabin." I groaned. "Please don't." He smiled. "At least it's over." I looked across the woods, at the property my grandfather built, at the cabin that survived decades of storms, only to nearly become an HOA business venture. Then I smiled. Yeah, it's over. And for the first time in months, it truly was. How would you like HOA stories? Please like, share, and subscribe my channel for more HOA interesting HOA stories.